The slap echoed through the courthouse hallway like thunder. Margaret's head spun to the side, her glasses flew across the marble floor, and the metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. She was 73 years old, had been in a wheelchair for 8 years, and had just been assaulted by a police officer inside the building where she had worked for 3 decades. "Useless old woman!" Officer Dawson spat the words while holding her wrist hard enough to leave marks. "Think you can come in here without ID? Are these wheelchairs the new trick for bums to get into public buildings?" Margaret felt the taste of her own blood, mixed with something much more bitter, public humiliation. Around her, at least 15 people witnessed the scene. Lawyers with their expensive briefcases, interns with wide eyes, security guards looking away. No one moved. No one protested. "Sir," she tried to keep her voice steady, even with her lips starting to swell, "if you would allow me to explain—" "Shut up!" Dawson squeezed her wrist even tighter, making her groan in pain. At 73, her bones were no longer the same. Any extra pressure could cause a fracture. "Old people like you are the worst. You pretend to be frail, then complain about police brutality when we do our job." He turned to his colleague, Officer Morrison, who was holding his phone, recording everything with a smile on his face. "You getting this? Another one trying to play the victim?" Morrison laughed. "Got it all, partner. This is going to the WhatsApp group. The guys are gonna love it." Margaret closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, counted to 5 mentally, a technique she used when she needed to maintain composure in absurd situations. And over her 73 years, she had seen many absurd situations, but none like this one. "My name is Margaret Ann Caldwell. For 31 years I was a federal judge in this court. I presided over more than 18,000 cases. I convicted serial killers, corrupt politicians, drug traffickers and, ironically, police officers who abused their power. I retired 2 years ago due to health issues, but I still keep my office on the 5th floor of this building, where I work as a legal consultant for complex cases. And at this exact moment, handcuffed and bleeding on the floor of my own courthouse, I was about to teach these 2 uniformed idiots the most expensive lesson of their lives." "Documents," Dawson demanded, lifting Margaret from the wheelchair with such force that she almost fell. Only the support of the chair's arms prevented her from collapsing completely. "I want to see ID, proof of residence, and a damn explanation of what you're doing here." "My purse," Margaret indicated with her head the brown leather bag that had fallen during the initial assault. "It's all in there." Morrison grabbed the purse and dumped the contents on the floor without any care. Lipstick, tissues, high blood pressure medication, wallet, keys, and a thin leather folder with the golden seal of the federal court embossed on the front. He completely ignored the folder and grabbed the wallet, opening it carelessly. "Margaret Caldwell," he read aloud, making a face. "Address on Riverside Drive. Fancy neighborhood for an old lady in a wheelchair, don't you think, Dawson? Probably lives on someone's charity," Dawson replied with contempt. "Or worse, is squatting on some property. I've seen this movie before." Margaret wanted to laugh. The irony was so absurd, it was almost comical. They were 10 feet away from an entire wall with official photographs of every judge who had ever served in that court. Her photo was right there, 3rd from the left in the 2nd row with the bronze plaque underneath. Honorable Margaret A. Caldwell, 1991-2023. But she said nothing. Not yet. "Look at this here." Morrison showed something he found in the wallet. An expired building access card. This old hag was trying to use a stolen card to get in. The card was not expired. It was perfectly valid, with automatic lifetime renewal for retired judges. But Margaret knew they wouldn't read the details. People like Dawson and Morrison didn't read. They assumed, judged, and acted. That was exactly why she had convicted 17 police officers throughout her career. And now she had 2 new candidates for her list. "Let's take her," Dawson decided, grabbing the handcuffs from his belt. Attempted trespassing, use of false document, resisting authority. I didn't resist anything, Margaret interrupted calmly. The slap came faster this time. Harder. Her head hit the metal support of the wheelchair, and for a moment everything went blurry. She felt something warm trickle down her temple. Blood. I said, "Shut up," Dawson bellowed, his face red with rage. "Wretched old woman! Who do you think you are to talk to me like that?" A good question, a question that would be answered in approximately 45 minutes when Margaret entered that courtroom wearing something other than casual clothes, something black, with gold embroidery on the sleeves, something these two imbeciles would recognize too late. But first, she needed to let them dig a hole deep enough. "Sorry, officer," Margaret said with the weakest and most submissive voice she could produce. "Please, don't hurt me anymore. I'm just a confused old woman who got the wrong entrance." Perfect. Dawson relaxed immediately, satisfied with her submission. Morrison continued recording, now with an even bigger smile on his face. "That's how it has to be." Dawson nodded, locking the handcuffs on Margaret's fragile wrists, the metal bit into her paper-thin skin. "Respect. That's all we ask. But you people like you, think you can challenge authority and get away with it. People like you." Margaret engraved those words in her memory. More ammunition for the arsenal she was mentally building. "Morrison, take her to the holding room," Dawson ordered, wiping his hands on his pants as if he had touched something dirty. "We're going to process her properly. Do everything by the book, no loopholes. I want the judge to understand we did everything right when he sees this case." Oh, the judge was definitely going to see this case. Margaret almost smiled but held back. As Morrison pushed her wheelchair down the hallway, passing through the same doors she had walked through thousands of times as a judge, Margaret observed everything with clinical attention. How many security cameras captured the assault? At least 7, she counted. How many witnesses? 15, maybe 20. All with cell phones in hand. In the holding room, Morrison left her alone for a few minutes. Margaret took the opportunity to examine the environment. Grey walls, a metal table, 3 chairs, and a security camera in the upper right corner. Perfect. Everything being recorded. The door opened again, and Dawson entered with a clipboard and an expression of fake concern. "So, Margaret," he began, sitting across from her with his elbows on the table, "let's have an honest little chat here. You seem like a respectable lady. I'm sure this is all a big misunderstanding." Ah, now came the interesting part, the attempted manipulation. "If you cooperate, tell the truth about how you got that access card, about who sent you to try to get in here, maybe I can talk to the prosecutor. Ask him to go easy on you because of your age." Margaret looked at him in silence, observed every detail, the sweat stains on the armpits of his uniform, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands. He was nervous. "Why?" "I have nothing to confess," she said simply. "I have worked in this building for over 30 years. Dawson slammed his hand on the table hard, making Margaret jump slightly. "Liar! Old liar! Do you think I'm an idiot? Do you think I don't see people like you every day trying to trick the system? People like you. Once again. You know what your problem is?" Dawson continued, standing up and starting to pace the room. "You think you can invent any story, any lie, and everyone will believe it. Oh, I'm a judge. Oh, I'm a lawyer. Oh, I live here. Lie after lie." Margaret kept her expression neutral, but inside she was cataloguing every word, every gesture, every additional piece of evidence Dawson generously provided for the case she was already mentally building. Morrison entered again, this time with a folder of documents. "Dawson, look at this. I got her history from the system. Margaret Caldwell, 73 years old, widow, no criminal record. But man, she has about 15 calls registered to this place in the last few months, complaining about inappropriate treatment and abusive security. The two officers exchanged a meaningful look. "Ah, so she's one of those." Dawson laughed without humor. "A professional activist, a police lawsuit hunter." Margaret took a deep breath. Those 15 calls were legitimate complaints about other cases of abuse she had witnessed during her visits to the court. Cases she meticulously documented, recorded in formal reports, and sent to the competent authorities. Authorities who, apparently, completely ignored her complaints. But now she had something better than phone complaints. She had first-hand evidence. She had marks of assault on her own body. She had two officers too arrogant to realize they were being recorded by 7 different cameras, and in less than an hour she would have the perfect platform to present all of this before witnesses who couldn't ignore it. "Let's do this," Dawson decided, sitting down again. "You're going to sign a confession admitting to attempted trespassing. In exchange, I recommend community service instead of prison. After all, at your age, jail would practically be a death sentence." He pushed a paper across the table, along with a pen. Margaret looked at the document, looked at Dawson, looked at Morrison, who continued recording everything with his cell phone. And finally, for the first time since she was assaulted, she smiled. "Officer Dawson," she said calmly, "I am not going to sign absolutely anything. But I have a better suggestion. How about we wait until the 11 a.m. hearing? I think you'll find it quite enlightening." Dawson frowned, confused. Morrison stopped recording for a second. "What hearing?" Dawson asked. Margaret adjusted herself in the wheelchair, ignoring the pain in her wrist where the handcuffs were too tight. Her expression revealed nothing, but her eyes shone with something that Dawson, if he were smarter, would have recognized as danger. "The hearing," she replied simply, "where all of this will be clarified. I'm sure you'll want to be present." And while Dawson tried to decipher what that meant, Margaret closed her eyes and waited. Waited for the moment when the truth would explode in those two's faces like a bomb. If you are enjoying seeing how this revenge story is unfolding, stay until the end, because the twist will be epic. The clock on the wall marked 10:47 a.m., 13 minutes to the hearing. 13 minutes for 2 police officers to discover the most expensive mistake of their careers. And Margaret, bleeding and handcuffed in her own wheelchair, had never felt so in control in her entire life. At 10:52 a.m., Dawson received a call that made his face lose all color. He left the room quickly, leaving Morrison guarding Margaret with that idiotic smile still on his face. Through the ajar door, she could hear fragments of the conversation. "Yes, sir. I understand, but she had no visible ID." "How was I supposed to know that?" Margaret knew that tone. It was the tone of someone realizing they stepped on a landmine, but still hoping the damage would be small. Poor Dawson. He had no idea of the size of the explosion that was coming. When Dawson returned, his demeanor had changed completely. No longer the confident aggressor. Now he looked like a cornered animal trying to find a way out. "Look, Mrs. Caldwell," he began, and Margaret immediately noticed the change in address. From useless old woman to Mrs. Caldwell, in a matter of a phone call. "There was a little misunderstanding here. My supervisor wants to talk to you before we proceed with any formal procedure." "Misunderstanding?" Margaret repeated the word, savoring every syllable. "Is that what you call assaulting an elderly woman in a wheelchair?" "Interesting choice of words, Officer Dawson." Morrison stopped smiling. For the first time, he seemed genuinely worried. "You need to understand our position," Dawson tried to justify, and Margaret almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Every day we deal with people trying to enter restricted areas. We can't simply believe everyone who says they work here. "So the standard procedure," Margaret said calmly, "is to punch the elderly in the face without even checking their identification? Is that what's in the police manual?" Silence. "Because if it is," she continued, "I would very much like to see that manual, especially during the hearing that starts in," she looked at the clock on the wall, "7 minutes." The door opened again, and a man in a sergeant's uniform rushed in. John Patterson. Margaret recognized him immediately. She had dined at his house 3 years ago during a court get-together. His wife made an exceptional pasta sauce. Patterson stopped frozen when he saw Margaret. His eyes went straight to the swollen lip, the cut on her temple, the handcuffs on her wrists. "My God," he whispered. "Judge Caldwell." Dawson and Morrison looked at each other, confusion stamped on their faces. "Judge." Morrison was the first to speak. "What judge? She said she was a judge, but—" "Shut up, Morrison!" Patterson exploded with a fury that made the two officers recoil. "Shut your damn mouth!" He turned to Dawson, and Margaret saw something in the sergeant's eyes she rarely saw in people. Genuine fear. "You," Patterson said, his voice shaking with contained rage, "just assaulted the Honorable Margaret Ann Caldwell, retired federal judge of this court, former president of the National Association of Magistrates, special consultant to the Department of Justice, and oh yes, the woman who sent 17 corrupt police officers to federal prison during her career." The silence that followed was so absolute that Margaret could hear her own breathing. Dawson had turned white as a sheet. Morrison dropped his phone on the floor, the screen cracking with the impact. "Sergeant Patterson," Margaret said calmly, as if commenting on the weather, "I appreciate the recognition, but I think it would be more productive if we discuss this in the presence of Judge Harrison. The hearing starts in 5 minutes. Patterson approached immediately to remove the handcuffs, but Margaret raised her hand, stopping him. "Leave them," she said. "I want to enter that room exactly as I am now. With the marks, the blood, the handcuffs, I want everyone to see what these two did. Judge Caldwell, Dawson tried to speak, but Margaret cut him off with a single look. "You will have your chance to speak, Officer Dawson, in front of the judge, under oath. Just like you said you'd like me to do, remember? Do everything properly, by the book, no loopholes." She repeated his exact words. "We're going to do exactly that." Patterson motioned for the two officers to accompany her. The walk to the courtroom was the longest of Dawson and Morrison's lives. With every step, more people stopped to watch. Lawyers who recognized Margaret murmured amongst themselves, shocked. Court employees took photos discreetly. Margaret knew that in less than an hour, those images would be in every WhatsApp group in the legal circuit. By the end of the day, they would be on social media. By the end of the week, on national news. Perfect. Courtroom number 3 was packed. The case scheduled for that morning was a lawsuit against the city for police brutality. Irony of ironies. Margaret had been called as an expert consultant for the defense to analyze use-of-force protocols. Judge Thomas Harrison was on the bench, reviewing documents. When the door opened and Margaret entered in her wheelchair, handcuffed and bleeding, Harrison dropped the pen he was holding. "What the hell?" "Good morning, Thomas," Margaret greeted him as if she were arriving for afternoon tea. "Sorry for the delay. I had a little setback at the entrance." The entire room turned to look. The lawyers, the prosecutor, the defendant, the jury members waiting, everyone froze upon seeing the scene. "Margaret?" Harrison came down from the bench immediately. "What happened to you? Who did this?" Margaret pointed with her head to Dawson and Morrison, who entered behind her, escorted by Patterson. "Officers Dawson and Morrison welcomed me in the lobby this morning with a practical demonstration of exactly the type of police brutality I came here to testify about today. How convenient, don't you think?" The prosecutor, David Chen, a man Margaret had known for 15 years, stood up so fast he knocked over his chair. "Judge Caldwell, my God, I will personally—" "You won't do anything yet, David," Margaret interrupted him. "First, let's conduct this hearing properly. Then we will deal with this." She raised her handcuffed wrists. Harrison looked at Patterson with an expression that mixed shock and fury. "Sergeant, explain. Now." Patterson took a deep breath before answering. "Your Honor, from what I've been able to ascertain in the last few minutes, Judge Caldwell arrived at the courthouse at 10:35 a.m. for her participation as a consultant in this case. Officers Dawson and Morrison, who were covering the lobby security shift, allege that she refused to present proper identification." "I didn't refuse anything," Margaret corrected calmly. "I tried to show my identification. Officer Dawson hit me before I could finish opening my wallet." Dawson stepped forward, desperate. "Your Honor, I didn't know who she was. She didn't have a badge, no visible ID, and when I tried to verify—" "You assaulted me," Margaret completed, "in front of approximately 20 witnesses, 7 security cameras, and your colleague's cell phone, who kindly recorded everything for posterity." Morrison paled even more, if that was possible. "So you have proof?" Harrison asked, and Margaret noticed the tone in his voice. He wasn't just shocked. He was furious. Thomas Harrison was known for being strict but fair, and if there was one thing he hated more than anything else, it was abuse of authority. "Multiple proofs," Margaret confirmed. "Video, audio, witnesses, and the physical evidence you can see on my face at this very moment." She paused, letting that sink in for every person present in the room. "But Thomas, if I may, I would like to do this the right way. I have a suggestion." Harrison crossed his arms. "I'm listening." "You are presiding over a police brutality case today. I was supposed to testify as an expert on use of force protocols. How about we turn this into a practical lesson?" The whole room held its breath. "I propose the following," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. "Let's see the evidence from this morning. Let's hear the testimonies. Let's analyze the protocols that were, or were not, followed. And let's let everyone in this room, especially the jury that will judge the original case, see with their own eyes how abuse of authority works in practice." Harrison thought for a long moment. Margaret could see the gears turning in his head. She had known that man for 20 years. He was meticulous, detail-oriented, and absolutely incorruptible. "Prosecutor Chen," Harrison finally spoke, "what is your position on this?" Chen, still visibly shaken, adjusted his glasses before answering. "Your Honor, considering the gravity of the allegations and the fact that the victim is a federal judge, respected for decades of exemplary service, I believe it would be appropriate to fully investigate this incident. If Judge Caldwell is willing to provide her testimony today, it would be negligence on my part not to accept." "Defense?" Harrison turned to the defendant's lawyer in the original case. Sarah Mitchell, a 35-year-old public defender whom Margaret had mentored when she was still an intern, stood up with a determined expression. "Your Honor, my client is being accused of assaulting a police officer during an approach that he alleges was unjustified and violent. If the court is about to examine a case of police assault against a federal judge, I believe it is extremely relevant to our case to see how trained officers conduct or do not conduct appropriate security procedures." Harrison nodded slowly. Margaret saw the exact moment he made his decision. "Very well. Sergeant Patterson, I want the security camera footage preserved and copied immediately. I want all available angles from 10:30 a.m. to 11 a.m. this morning. Officer Morrison, did you record anything on your personal cell phone?" Morrison tried to lie, but his face gave everything away. There might be some images." "Hand the phone to the bailiff. Now." Harrison wasn't asking. "And Officers Dawson and Morrison, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. You have the right to an attorney—" "Wait," Dawson interrupted, panic evident in his voice. "Your Honor, this isn't necessary. It was just a misunderstanding. I can explain." "You can explain under oath," Harrison cut him off. "Just as you expected Judge Caldwell to do. After all, you said yourself you wanted to do everything by the book, no loopholes, didn't you?" Margaret had to bite her lip, which hurt because of the swelling, not to smile. Harrison had clearly spoken to Patterson before the hearing and already knew some details, and he was using Dawson's own words against him. Poetic. "Now," Harrison continued, returning to the bench, "let's start this hearing properly. Judge Caldwell, even though it is extremely irregular given your condition, are you still willing to testify?" "Absolutely," Margaret answered without hesitation. "And you maintain your allegation that you were assaulted without provocation by Officers Dawson and Morrison?" "I do, and I have irrefutable proof to back up every word." Harrison banged the gavel. "Then so be it. Bailiff, please remove Judge Caldwell's handcuffs. Immediately." When the metal finally came off her wrists, Margaret could see the deep marks left behind. More evidence. She rubbed her wrists gently, feeling the blood return to circulate. "Officer Morrison," Harrison called, "bring your phone here. Let's start by examining the video you found so funny you needed to record it." As Morrison, reluctant, walked to the front of the room, Margaret adjusted herself in her wheelchair. The pain in her face was throbbing, but she ignored it. She had waited 2 years for retirement, 8 years since the accident that left her in a wheelchair, and 73 years to witness justice being served so perfectly ironically. Dawson and Morrison thought they knew the system, thought they knew how to manipulate it, thought an elderly woman in a wheelchair would be just another silent victim. They were about to learn that underestimating Margaret Ann Caldwell was the biggest mistake they could have made, and the whole room was about to have a lesson on exactly how justice worked when you assaulted the wrong person. Morrison's cell phone, projected onto the giant screen of the courtroom, showed something that made even the most experienced lawyers recoil in their chairs. The video began with Margaret approaching the court entrance, pushing her own wheelchair with the quiet dignity of someone who had made that journey 1,000 times before. "You can press play," Harrison ordered the technician. Dawson's voice exploded through the speakers. "Another beggar wanting to get in. These wheelchairs are the new trick." In the courtroom, 3 people on the jury looked at each other, uncomfortable. Margaret observed their reactions with clinical attention. This was the crucial moment, when ordinary people saw with their own eyes what she had faced for decades in abstract reports and testimonies. In the video, Margaret tried to explain something, her mouth moving calmly. Then came the slap. Loud, clear, brutal, her head spinning, her glasses flying. One of the jurors brought her hand to her mouth, stifling a scream. "Useless old woman," Dawson's voice continued on the video. "Think you can come in here without ID?" Harrison paused the video. "Officer Dawson," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "At this specific moment of the recording, had you already requested identification from Judge Caldwell?" Dawson opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. "I was about to answer the question, yes or no. Had you requested identification before assaulting her?" Absolute silence. "No," Dawson finally admitted, his voice barely rising above a whisper. "Continue the video," Harrison ordered. The next 2 minutes were excruciating. The entire room watched as Dawson squeezed Margaret's wrist with excessive force, as he threw the contents of her purse on the floor, as he completely ignored the folder with the federal seal. And worse, as Morrison recorded everything laughing. "This is going to the WhatsApp group," Morrison's voice echoed through the room. "The guys are gonna love it." Harrison paused again and turned to Morrison with an expression that made the officer recoil instinctively. "Officer Morrison, do you consider assault against the elderly entertainment worthy of sharing on social media?" Morrison couldn't formulate an answer. "And tell me," Harrison continued, "this WhatsApp group, how many other similar videos were shared there? The question hung in the air like a guillotine about to fall. Margaret saw the exact moment Morrison realized there was no good answer to that. Admitting there were other videos would confirm a pattern of abuse. Denying it would be lying under a federal investigation that would inevitably find the messages. "I don't remember other videos," Morrison tried. "Don't remember," Harrison repeated in disbelief. "Let's come back to that. Continue." The video then showed the part where Dawson handcuffed Margaret, her fragile hands being twisted behind her back without any care. Showed when he called her wretched. Showed every second of humiliation that Margaret endured in silence. When the video ended, the silence in the room was deafening. "Judge Caldwell," Harrison finally spoke, "do you need medical attention? I can pause this hearing to—" "It won't be necessary, Thomas," Margaret interrupted him gently. "The injuries are superficial. My dignity, however, demands that we continue. These people," she gestured to the jury, "deserve to see this through to the end." Harrison nodded respectfully. "Very well. Sergeant Patterson, were the lobby security cameras preserved?" "Yes, Your Honor. We have 7 different angles of the incident. All confirm exactly what we saw in Officer Morrison's video." "Witnesses?" 18 people present at the moment of the assault. 17 have already given preliminary statements. All confirm use of excessive force and abusive language. Margaret allowed herself a discreet smile. 17 out of 18. The only person who didn't confirm was probably some colleague of Dawson's trying to protect him, but 17 witnesses against 1 was a losing battle. "Officer Dawson," Harrison turned to him with steely eyes, "would you like to explain your actions?" Dawson took a deep breath. Margaret could see the desperate attempt to reconstruct a narrative that made sense, that painted him as a victim of circumstances rather than a deliberate aggressor. "Your Honor, I was just following security protocols. After recent incidents involving attempted break-ins at the court, we received strict orders to verify anyone without visible identification." "Visible identification," Harrison repeated. "Judge Caldwell was carrying her purse with documents. Did you check before assaulting her? She wasn't cooperating. Answer the question, yes or no." "No, but—" "And at what point in your training," Harrison interrupted him, his voice growing in intensity, "was it taught that assaulting elderly people in wheelchairs is appropriate security protocol?" Dawson had no answer. "Let me rephrase," Harrison continued. "How many times during your 12-year career have you used physical force before even requesting identification?" The question was a perfect trap. Margaret recognized it immediately. If Dawson admitted he did this regularly, it would confirm a pattern of abuse. If he said it was the first time, then he would have to explain what was so special about Margaret that justified breaking his own protocol. "That varies depending on the perceived threat," Dawson tried to dodge. "Perceived threat," Harrison echoed. "What kind of threat exactly did a 73-year-old woman in a wheelchair represent?" Margaret decided to intervene. It was time to start tightening the noose. "Thomas, if I may," she said, "I believe I can clarify Officer Dawson's perception of threat." Harrison gestured for her to continue. Margaret took her purse, now returned, and removed a thin folder. The same one Morrison had completely ignored when scattering her belongings on the floor. "This folder contains documents related to an investigation I have been conducting for approximately 8 months. An investigation into patterns of racial discrimination and abuse of authority in the security department of this court." You could hear a pin drop in the silence that followed. "During these 8 months," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength, "I documented 43 incidents involving aggressive approaches to Black and Latino citizens in this building. I interviewed 26 victims. I reviewed hundreds of hours of security footage. And do you know which name appeared in 31 of those 43 incidents?" She looked directly at Dawson. "Yours, Officer Dawson." The bomb had dropped. Margaret saw the impact ripple through the room like a shockwave. Jury members leaned forward. Lawyers began whispering urgently amongst themselves. And Dawson finally understood that he wasn't just being judged for assaulting a judge. He was being judged for an entire career of systematic abuse. "Your Honor," Prosecutor Chen stood up, "I request that this investigation be formally attached to the record. If there is evidence of a pattern of criminal behavior—" "Granted," Harrison banged the gavel. "Judge Caldwell, are these documents available for review?" "All digitized, chronologically organized, with video testimonies and sworn statements. I can send it to the court system within an hour." Margaret opened the folder and took out a series of photographs. She passed them to the bailiff to distribute. "These are some of Officer Dawson's victims in the last 8 months. Marcus Johnson, 67 years old, aggressively approached for looking suspicious while waiting for his granddaughter, who is a lawyer here in the building. Rosa Martinez, 58 years old, called an illegal squatter, despite working in cleaning at this court for 15 years. James Washington, retired doctor, handcuffed and detained for 40 minutes because Dawson didn't believe a black man could be a doctor." Each photo circulating through the room was an additional condemnation. Faces of ordinary people. People who had been humiliated, assaulted, treated like criminals for simply existing. "And do you know what all these cases have in common?" Margaret asked rhetorically. "None of them resulted in disciplinary action. None. Because the victims didn't have enough power to force an investigation, didn't have the right connections, didn't know how to navigate the system." She paused, letting that sink in. "But I do, and today, finally, those silenced voices will have their justice." Dawson tried one last desperate card. "She's making this up. It's a conspiracy to frame me because I—" "Because you what?" Margaret cut him off, her voice like a blade. "Because you are finally being held accountable? Because your victims weren't important enough until you assaulted someone with the power to fight back?" She turned to the entire room, to the jury, to everyone present. "That is the problem with systematic abuse. It continues because the victims are carefully chosen among the vulnerable, the elderly, minorities, people in wheelchairs, people whom the system failed repeatedly." Margaret wheeled her wheelchair closer to Harrison's bench. "But today, Officer Dawson made a fatal mistake. He chose the wrong victim, and now all those he brutalized with impunity will finally have their day in court." Harrison banged the gavel again. "Officer Dawson, Officer Morrison, you are suspended from duty effective immediately. Sergeant Patterson, confiscate their weapons, badges, and credentials. Immediately." As Patterson moved forward to execute the order, Margaret saw something in Dawson's eyes that satisfied her deeply. It was no longer arrogance. It was no longer contempt. It was genuine fear, the fear of someone who finally understood that actions have consequences. "But we are not finished here," Harrison continued. "Judge Caldwell, does your investigation mention other people involved in this pattern of abuse?" Margaret smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It does, Thomas. 3 supervisors who repeatedly ignored complaints, 2 officers who actively participated, and an entire network of complicity that allowed this to happen for years." She took another document from the folder. This one was thicker, spiral-bound, with the Department of Justice seal stamped on the cover. "And it turns out the FBI is very interested in investigations regarding systematic civil rights violations." The document landed on the table with a sound that echoed through the room like a cannon shot. Dawson and Morrison weren't just facing local charges for assault. They were about to face a full federal investigation into civil rights, and Margaret, bleeding but triumphant in her wheelchair, was just starting to show all the cards she had up her sleeve. The FBI document circulated through the room as if it were radioactive, Every person who touched it seemed to instantly understand the magnitude of what was about to happen. This was no longer just about two violent officers. It was about dismantling an entire system of corruption. Harrison flipped through the pages with an increasingly somber expression. Margaret watched, satisfied, as he absorbed months of meticulous work condensed into 300 pages of irrefutable evidence. "Judge Caldwell," Harrison finally spoke, "this report mentions intercepted communications between members of the Security Department. Communications that suggest prior knowledge and deliberate cover-up of multiple violations." "Correct," Margaret confirmed. "The FBI obtained a warrant for electronic monitoring 3 months ago. The WhatsApp group Officer Morrison mentioned so proudly, we have all the messages, all the photos, all the videos they shared thinking they were safe." Morrison turned green, literally green. "How many videos are we talking about?" Chen asked, already grabbing his laptop to start taking notes. Margaret didn't hesitate. She had these numbers memorized. 147 videos shared in the last 18 months. 93 show questionable use of force. 42 include explicit racial language. And 17, she paused strategically, show clear evidence of planting evidence or falsifying reports. The room exploded in murmurs. Harrison banged the gavel 3 times to restore order. "Does that mean," Sarah Mitchell, the public defender, stood up urgently, "that dozens, possibly hundreds of cases may have been compromised by criminal police conduct?" "Exactly," Margaret nodded. "And every single one of those cases will need to be reviewed, every conviction re-examined, every victim contacted and informed that their rights were violated systematically." Dawson finally exploded. "This is absurd. You can't use an isolated incident to destroy entire careers. I served this country for 12 years. You brutalized innocent citizens for 12 years. Margaret cut him off with surgical coldness. "And called it serving. There is a difference." She grabbed her tablet, which had miraculously survived the morning encounter, and connected it to the room's projection system. The large screen lit up, showing a meticulously organized spreadsheet. "This is the complete compilation of your career, Officer Dawson. Every documented stop, every use of force reported, every complaint filed. Notice the interesting pattern." Her finger slid across the screen, highlighting specific columns. "In 12 years of service, you made 1,147 stops. Of those, 1,603, that is 87%, involved non-white people. Curious, considering that the demographics of this area are 52% white." The numbers didn't lie. They never lied. And Margaret had spent 8 months ensuring every piece of data was verifiable, every statistic irrefutable. "Even more interesting," she continued, "is your use of force history. In stops of white citizens, you used physical force in only 8% of cases. In stops of non-white people, 67%. One of the jury members let out a low whistle of disbelief. "But wait, it gets better." Margaret advanced to the next slide. "Of the 247 formal complaints filed against you, 243 were deemed unfounded by Internal Affairs. That is a rejection rate of 98.4%. She turned to face Dawson directly. "Either you are the most unjustly accused police officer in history, or the system designed to police you failed completely. Which do you think is more likely?" Dawson had no answer. How could he? "And here is the icing on the cake." Margaret touched the screen again, revealing internal emails. "These are communications between your direct supervisor, Captain Rodriguez, and the head of Internal Affairs, explicitly discussing how to shelve complaints against you and other officers. I quote, 'We need to protect our men. These people will always complain. It's part of the game.'" Harrison read the projected email with growing incredulity. "That is documented obstruction of justice." "It is," Margaret agreed, "and there are dozens of similar emails, all archived, all preserved, all now in the hands of the FBI. Patterson, who had remained silent until then, seemed genuinely shaken. Margaret had known John Patterson for years. He was a good man, an honest cop, trapped in a rotten system. And now he was seeing in real time how deep the corruption around him was. "Judge Caldwell," Patterson said, his voice thick with emotion, "I swear I didn't know the extent of this. I heard rumors, but—" "I know, John," Margaret interrupted him gently. "That's why your name doesn't appear in this report as a suspect. You are one of the few clean people in this department, and frankly, we're going to need people with integrity to rebuild all of this afterward." She turned her attention back to Morrison, who was trying to make himself invisible in his chair. "Officer Morrison, you have been remarkably quiet. Perhaps because you know exactly how many of those 147 videos you personally recorded and shared?" Morrison opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "Let me help," Margaret offered, not gently at all. 63. You recorded 63 videos of police abuse and distributed them as if they were funny memes. You turned human suffering into entertainment for your colleagues. She zoomed in on a specific message on the screen. It was from Morrison, accompanying a video of a teenager being thrown to the ground. "Look at this little monkey trying to run away." The reaction in the room was immediate and visceral. Even the most cynical lawyers, accustomed to the worst faces of humanity, seemed disturbed. "That message," Harrison said slowly, "was sent how long ago?" 3 weeks, Margaret replied. "The little monkey in question is Jason Williams, 16 years old, honor student, who was returning from the library when he was stopped for no reason. He ended up with a broken nose and a fractured rib. The official report said he resisted arrest. The video clearly shows he had his hands raised when he was attacked." Sarah Mitchell was typing furiously on her laptop. "Jason Williams. I have that case. He was charged with assaulting an officer and resisting. He is awaiting trial on probation." "Not anymore," Harrison declared. "Bailiff, I want the charges against Jason Williams dropped immediately, and someone locate the prosecutor responsible for that case, because we are going to have a very serious conversation about professional ethics." Margaret allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Each small victory, each corrected life, each undone injustice. This was the reason she endured 8 months of discreet investigation. Why she endured being assaulted this morning without fighting back immediately, because she knew that strategic patience always beats violent impulse. "Your Honor," Chen stood up, adjusting his tie, "given the volume of evidence presented and the seriousness of the allegations, I formally request that the Department of Justice be notified immediately to take over a full investigation not only of Officers Dawson and Morrison, but of the entire command structure that allowed this to happen." "Granted. Anyone else?" Mitchell raised her hand. "I also request that all cases in the last 5 years involving the officers mentioned in this report be flagged for automatic review. We are potentially talking about hundreds of people who may be serving sentences for crimes they never committed or based on planted evidence." "Also granted." Dawson was crying now, silent tears streaming down his face, as his career, his reputation, and likely his freedom crumbled before his eyes. Margaret watched without pity. She had seen too many crocodile tears in her career to be moved by last-minute regret. "Officer Dawson," she said, and her voice was as cold as steel, "this morning you asked me who I thought I was. Let me answer now. I am the consequence. I am what happens when the system finally works. I am proof that no one, absolutely no one, is above the law." If you are still following this twist story, just wait until you see what happens when all this evidence hits the federal jury, because the best is yet to come. Harrison banged the gavel one last time in that session. "We will take a 2-hour recess. When we return, I want FBI representatives present, the Department of Justice notified, and a concrete action plan to review every compromised case. Officers Dawson and Morrison, you will remain in custody until the prosecutor formally decides on charges." When the officers were escorted out, handcuffed, irony of ironies, Margaret finally allowed the tension to leave her shoulders. The pain in her face had become a constant throbbing. The cut on her temple pulsed, but none of that mattered compared to the feeling of victory running through her veins. Patterson approached, crouching beside her wheelchair. "Judge Caldwell, I really didn't know. If I had any idea—" "I know, John," she put her hand on his shoulder, "and that's why I need you to stay. Someone needs to rebuild this department the right way. Someone who understands that the badge is not a license for brutality, but a responsibility for protection." He nodded, emotional. "I'll do it. I swear." While the room emptied, Sarah Mitchell approached with an expression of almost reverent admiration. "Judge Caldwell, my God, 8 months of investigation. How did you manage to keep all this secret?" Margaret smiled, finally allowing exhaustion to show. "With a lot of patience, Sarah. And with the understanding that some battles aren't won with frontal attacks. You build the case, gather the evidence, wait for the right moment, and then—" she paused significantly, "you let your enemies hang themselves with their own ropes." And Dawson had provided enough rope for a triple hanging. 2 hours later, the courtroom was unrecognizable. Where before there was just a local case of brutality, now there were 3 federal agents, 2 representatives from the Department of Justice, the federal district attorney, and an audience packed with journalists who had smelled blood in the water. Margaret observed everything from her wheelchair, positioned strategically where everyone could see her bruised face. Every purple mark, every cut, every visual evidence of violence served as a constant reminder of what was being judged there. Federal Agent Karen Morrison, no relation to Officer Morrison ironically, opened her leather briefcase and addressed Harrison with quiet authority. "Your Honor, after a preliminary review of Judge Caldwell's report and analysis of the evidence presented, the FBI is formally assuming jurisdiction over this case under federal civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to suppress criminal investigations." She paused, allowing the gravity of those words to sink in. "Additionally, we are issuing search and seizure warrants for the residences of Officers Dawson and Morrison, their vehicles, and all personal electronic devices. We are also freezing their financial assets until the conclusion of the investigation." Dawson tried to stand up, but Patterson pushed him back into the chair firmly. "Objection!" Dawson bellowed, desperate. "This is persecution! I have rights!" Agent Morrison turned to him with an expression that could freeze hell. "You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you start exercising that right immediately." Margaret had to hide her smile behind her hand. After 8 months building this moment, seeing it unfold with surgical perfection was almost poetic. "We have more." Federal Agent James Chen, also no relation to Prosecutor David Chen, the coincidence of surnames was becoming comical, opened his laptop. "Our Cybercrimes Division analyzed the WhatsApp group mentioned. We managed to recover deleted messages, including explicit coordination among officers to fabricate evidence." He projected a conversation on the screen. Dawson: "Got another one today. Tried to play the victim." Morrison: "Planted the baggie." Dawson: "Obviously. 2G of weed in the pocket. Gonna be about 6 months easy." Morrison: "This playbook never fails." The silence in the room was so deep you could hear hearts breaking. The jury from the original case looked at each other, horrified. How many innocent people were behind bars because of these monsters? "That conversation," Agent Chen continued, "is from March 14th of this year. The another one in question is Derek Thompson, 19 years old, no priors, who is serving an 8-month sentence for drug possession. Drugs that, as this conversation confirms, were planted. Sarah Mitchell was typing so fast her keys were practically smoking. Derek Thompson, I have the case here. He pleaded not guilty, but ended up taking a plea deal because he didn't have resources for a private lawyer. My office was overloaded, and we advised the deal. The guilt in her voice was palpable. Margaret knew that feeling. The weight of knowing the system failed someone who trusted it. It's not your fault, Sarah, Margaret said gently. It's theirs, and today we are going to correct every case, one by one. Federal Agent Morrison advanced to the next evidence. Besides the messages, we found suspicious bank transfers. In the last 3 years, Officer Dawson received deposits totaling $127,000 from an LLC registered in the Cayman Islands. Even Harrison seemed surprised by that. Dawson was being paid? He asked, incredulous. Apparently so. We are still tracking the source, but the LLC is registered under the name of Marcus Vaughn, a criminal defense attorney known for defending local gang members. Our theory is that Dawson was being paid to plant evidence, fabricate cases, and ensure specific arrests. The puzzle was coming together piece by piece, revealing a conspiracy much larger than just police brutality. It was systemic corruption. It was justice being sold to the highest bidder. Margaret had suspected this during her investigation, but didn't have enough proof. Now, with the FBI's resources, the pieces finally fit. Officer Morrison, Agent Morrison turned to him, your situation is no better. Although we haven't found evidence of direct payments, you actively participated in at least 43 cases where evidence was fabricated. That makes you an accomplice. Morrison was pale as a ghost. I just recorded. I never planted anything. I just documented federal crimes and remained silent, the agent completed. That is called complicity, and it carries the same penalty. Harrison banged the gavel, restoring order as murmurs ran through the room. I want all cases involving these officers reviewed by an independent task force. I want every person imprisoned by planted evidence located and compensated, and I want to know who else is involved in this. The federal prosecutor, Linda Santos, stood up for the first time. Your Honor, we are preparing formal charges not only against Dawson and Morrison, but against Captain Rodriguez for obstruction of justice, the head of Internal Affairs for complicity, and we are investigating 3 judges who consistently ignored evidence of police misconduct. 3 judges. Margaret wasn't surprised, but it still hurt. They were colleagues, people she had known for decades, and they had betrayed everything the office represented. One of those judges, Santos continued, and Margaret already knew the name before she spoke, is Judge Richard Blackwood, who presided over 73% of cases involving Dawson and Morrison. In all those cases, he denied defense motions questioning police procedures. Richard Blackwood. Margaret had had lunch with him last week. He had complained about how criminals today had too many rights. Now she understood why he thought that. Because rights got in the way of his corruption scheme. Judge Caldwell, Santos addressed her directly, your report mentions that you tried to report suspicions of judicial corruption 6 months ago. Can you elaborate? Margaret nodded, taking another document from her apparently infinite folder. In June of this year, I noticed a disturbing pattern in Judge Blackwood's decisions. He was systematically denying legitimate motions, ignoring evidence of misconduct, and handing down disproportionately harsh sentences to defendants defended by public lawyers. She passed the document to Santos. I sent a formal report to the State Judicial Council. I was informed that my concerns were unfounded and that I was overestimating statistical coincidences. 3 weeks later, I received an anonymous call suggesting I stop making waves if I wanted to keep my reputation intact. The scandal was growing exponentially by the minute. It wasn't just about two violent cops. It was about an entire system rotten from the root. "And yet," Harrison said, admiration in his voice, "you kept investigating." "Because that is the job," Margaret replied simply. "When the system fails, someone needs to fix it, even if that someone is a 73-year-old woman in a wheelchair who everyone underestimates." She looked directly at Dawson. "You underestimated me this morning. You saw a vulnerable old woman and thought she would be just another easy victim, another person to brutalize without consequences, another story that would be buried under false reports and failed internal investigations." Margaret wheeled her wheelchair until she was face to face with him. "But do you know what your fatal mistake was? You chose the only person in this building who had the knowledge, resources, and persistence to turn your arrogance into irrefutable criminal evidence." Dawson was weeping openly now, all the weight of his actions finally crushing him. "I'm so sorry," he sobbed. "I didn't know. If I knew who you were, if you knew who I was." Margaret cut him off, her voice like ice. "You would have been polite, respectful, professional, and all those you brutalized over the last 12 years would still be suffering in silence because you would have continued choosing victims with no power to fight back." She pulled away with disdain. "Your regret isn't for having done it, it's for getting caught. And that is exactly the reason why you will spend the next 20 years in a federal prison thinking about your choices." Agent Morrison presented the final details. 8 additional officers being investigated, 16 confirmed cases of planted evidence, more than 200 potential victims to be contacted. When the session ended, when Dawson and Morrison were led away handcuffed to federal custody, when the journalists ran to file their explosive stories, Margaret stood alone in the courtroom for a moment. Patterson entered silently, sitting beside her. "How did you stand 8 months keeping all this inside?" he asked. Margaret touched the cut on her temple, still tender. "Because I knew that one day of pain would be worth decades of justice. Because every person they hurt deserved to see their aggressors answer for it. And because," she smiled for the first time with sincerity, "revenge served cold is infinitely more satisfying than hot anger." Outside, the sun was setting over the courthouse, but inside that room, justice had finally been born. 3 months later, Margaret was sitting in her office on the 5th floor, the same office Dawson had prevented her from reaching that fateful morning, reviewing reports. But these weren't investigation reports, they were victory reports. Derek Thompson, the 19-year-old who had drugs planted on him, had been released after serving 5 unjust months. The city paid $850,000 in compensation. He was now studying engineering at the State University on a full scholarship funded by a trust created specifically for Dawson's victims. Marcus Johnson, the 67-year-old grandfather brutalized for looking suspicious, received $1.2 million. He used part of the money to open a community center offering free legal assistance to victims of police abuse. Rosa Martinez, the cleaner called an illegal squatter despite working there for 15 years, not only received substantial compensation, but was promoted to supervisor of the cleaning department with a 40% salary increase. The court made a point of issuing a public apology. In total, 127 people had their convictions overturned. 17 were released from prison. 83 received financial compensation totaling $47 million, and every penny came from the pension fund of the corrupt police department that allowed it to happen. Justice has a price, and this time the guilty paid it. The office door opened, and Sarah Mitchell entered carrying a box of donuts and 2 coffees. "Brought reinforcements," she announced, placing everything on the table. "Thought you'd need sugar and caffeine to read today's news." Margaret took the newspaper Sarah offered. The main headline showed Dawson being taken to federal prison in chains. Former officer sentenced to 28 years for conspiracy and civil rights violations. 28 years, Margaret murmured, savouring every word. He'll be 67 when he gets out. The same age Marcus Johnson was when he was brutalised. Morrison got 18, Sarah added, and took a plea bargain. Gave up 6 more officers involved in the bribery scheme. Margaret flipped through the paper, finding another headline. Judge Blackwood resigns under federal investigation. 3rd magistrate to fall in court corruption scandal. 3 judges, 12 police officers, 2 prosecutors, 1 captain, and a head of internal affairs, all fallen like dominoes, each pushing the next as they tried to save their own skins. The system that protected monsters had finally imploded under the weight of its own rot. There's more, Sarah said, a conspiratorial smile on her face. The governor announced this morning a state commission to review all police departments. Guess who was named lead consultant? Margaret raised an eyebrow. You're kidding. I'm not. You, officially, will oversee the reform of the entire state public safety system. Annual salary of $300,000, a staff of 20 people, and authority to implement any change you deem necessary. Margaret leaned back in her chair, processing that. She had spent 31 years as a judge, 2 years retired, and now, at 73, she was about to embark on the most important mission of her life, ensuring that no other person had to suffer what she and so many others suffered. When do I start? She asked. Next Monday. But before that, Sarah pulled up a chair and sat down, becoming serious. I need to ask you something. That morning, when Dawson hit you, you could have revealed who you were immediately, could have avoided all the pain, all the humiliation. Why didn't you? Margaret remained silent for a long moment, looking out the window at the courthouse down below. The same courthouse where it all began 3 months ago. Because if I had revealed who I was, she finally answered, Dawson would have backed down, would have apologized, would have invented a story about a misunderstanding, and in the end would have continued doing exactly the same to people who didn't have my power or position. She turned to Sarah. I needed him to show his true nature, needed him to feel safe enough to be the monster he always was, because monsters are only defeated when they are completely exposed. Sarah nodded, understanding. You used yourself as bait. I transformed myself into the perfect evidence, Margaret corrected. Irrefutable, unquestionable, impossible to hide or explain. And it worked. Patterson appeared at the door, now wearing a captain's uniform. He had been promoted to rebuild the court's security department. Under his leadership, there hadn't been a single incident of brutality in 3 months. Complaints had dropped 94%, and employee satisfaction was at an all-time high. Judge Caldwell, he said respectfully, just wanted to inform you that we installed the new body camera protocols you suggested. Automatic cloud backup every 30 seconds, no option to turn off. And we created an anonymous reporting system that goes straight to independent review, bypassing the internal chain of command. Excellent, John. And the training? All new recruits now go through 40 hours of training in civil rights and de-escalation before being authorized to carry weapons, and we implemented mandatory quarterly review of all interactions recorded by cameras. Margaret smiled with satisfaction. Real change. Systemic change, not just punishing the guilty, but rebuilding the system to prevent new guilty parties from emerging. Oh, Patterson added, and you need to see this. He turned on the television mounted on the wall. A national news broadcast was on air, showing images of the courthouse. In an unprecedented development, Judge Margaret Caldwell's case has inspired over 200 similar investigations in police departments across the country. The Department of Justice announced today the creation of a national task force dedicated exclusively to investigating patterns of police brutality and systemic corruption. The reporter continued, but Margaret was barely listening. She was watching the images of people marching with signs. They weren't violent protests, they were peaceful vigils. Ordinary people holding candles and photos of loved ones who had been victims of police abuse. One of the signs showed Margaret's face next to the words, "If she can fight at 73, we can fight at any age." Another said, "Justice has no expiration date." "You've become a symbol," Sarah said softly. "People are calling you the judge who didn't bow." Margaret gave a short laugh. "I prefer the stubborn old woman who refused to die quietly." The three people in the office laughed together, but it was a laugh of relief, of victory, of hope that finally had a solid foundation. Margaret's phone rang. It was a number she recognized immediately, the White House. "Judge Caldwell," the voice on the other end was formal but warm. "The President would like to know if you would be available for a ceremony next week. He wants to award you the Presidential Medal of Freedom for your extraordinary services to American justice." Margaret looked at the almost healed marks on her face in the window reflection. The purple had faded to greenish yellow. The cut on the temple was now just a thin line, but the internal scars, those would never completely disappear, and maybe they shouldn't. Scars were reminders of battles won, of prices paid, of justice conquered inch by inch. "Tell the President," Margaret replied, "that it will be an honor, but I only accept if Derek Thompson, Marcus Johnson, Rosa Martinez, and all the other victims are present too. They are the real heroes of this story." When she hung up, Sarah was wiping tears discreetly. "You really don't do anything small, do you?" "When you're 73 and in a wheelchair," Margaret replied with a smile, "you learn that you don't have time for half measures. Either you go big or you don't even bother." She wheeled her chair to the window, observing the flow of people entering and leaving the courthouse. Lawyers, defendants, victims, family members, each with their own story, each hoping the system worked for them. And now, maybe for the first time in decades, there was a real chance it would work. "You know what's ironic?" Margaret said aloud. "Dawson assaulted me because he saw me as weak, vulnerable, powerless. He looked at an old woman in a wheelchair and saw an easy victim." She turned to face Sarah and Patterson. "But vulnerability isn't weakness. Age isn't a limitation. And underestimating someone based on appearances is the most expensive mistake you can make." Patterson nodded with conviction. "I'm going to put that on the first slide of the new recruit training." The sun was setting again, painting the sky orange and pink through the office window. Margaret thought about how many sunsets she had seen in the last 73 years. How many battles, how many victories and defeats, how many moments when she could have given up, bowed down, accepted that the system was too broken to fix. But she didn't give up. And now, hundreds of people had their lives back thanks to that stubbornness. "You know what the best moment of all this was?" Margaret asked suddenly. "When Dawson was convicted," Sarah guessed. "When Harrison banged the gavel?" Patterson tried. "No," Margaret smiled. "It was when that boy, Derek Thompson, got out of prison and hugged his mother, when he looked at me and said, 'Thank you for not giving up on us.' That moment was worth every second of pain." She paused. "Because in the end, justice isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. It's about taking what was broken and rebuilding something better. It's about ensuring that the next Derek, the next Marcus, the next Rosa doesn't have to go through the same hell. If you stayed here following this journey of justice, I hope you take away a lesson. Never underestimate the power of a person determined to do what is right. And if you believe everyone deserves justice, regardless of age or position, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Because real stories like this need to be told. Margaret Ann Caldwell grabbed her purse, the same one that was thrown on the floor 3 months ago, and started to leave the office. "Where are you going now?" Sarah asked. "To visit all 127 people who had their lives given back. I want to look each one in the eye and say, 'Your suffering was not in vain. Your story matters, and together we change the system.'" She stopped at the door and turned one last time. "And then, on Monday, I start the next battle. because justice doesn't rest, and neither do I. At 73 years old, in a wheelchair with battle scars on her face, Margaret Ann Caldwell wheeled down the courthouse hallway with the posture of someone who had just won a war, because that was exactly what she had done. And for anyone who thought age, disability or position defined them, Margaret had proven that the only real limit is accepting injustice without fighting. Dawson chose the wrong victim that morning. He saw weakness where there was tempered steel, saw vulnerability where there were decades of judicial experience, saw an old woman when he should have seen a force of nature, and he paid the highest price possible. Lost his freedom, his reputation, and any chance of redemption. Meanwhile, Margaret gained something much more valuable than personal revenge. She gained a legacy, a reformed system, hundreds of restored lives, and the definitive proof that justice, when served with patience, precision, and unwavering conviction, always prevails. No matter how long it takes, no matter how many blows you need to endure. In the end, the truth is an unstoppable force, and Margaret Ann Caldwell was living proof of that.